Who is this a photograph of? Most oftentimes it's referred to as a photograph describing Jacusa. Now, this is not a photograph of Jacusa because photography wasn't invented during the time frame to which he lived, but it represents the fact of the black samurai in Japan around in the late 1500s. But Jacusa, a real person who did exist, is a little known African black history. So, who is this guy and why is he important today? Because racists are going to racist. That is why he's important today. So recently, Ubisoft decided in their upcoming series, and they announced it May 15th, 2024, but in the new Assassin's Creed Shadows, Jacusa is going to be one of the primary characters to which the story will revolve around, and a character that you can play. If it wasn't for my son, I wouldn't even know about this because he's into the anime stuff. But anyway, when this came out, all the races came to play, claiming that he was not a real samurai, that he was only a sword bearer for the Japanese warlord Nobunga. I'm saying the name so wrong, so excuse me, but Nobunga, that he was just a sword bearer for him. But one of the things that they do not realize is that in the 16th century in Japan, the use of the term samurai was commonly used for anyone who was in the fighting service of any of the Japanese warlords during the time frame. So the title of samurai could have and most likely would have been allocated to Jacusa. Now, let's talk about who Jacusa really was, because he also inspired Afro Samurai, which is actually the anime story cartoon thing that my son had me watching, but he was the inspiration for Afro Samurai. But Jacusa, whose real name wasn't Jacusa, that was the name that he was given once he became under the service of Oda Nobunga. I'm saying that so messed up. But anyway, so what had happened is that this gentleman most likely was a child slave out of Mozambique who was then raised in India with the Christian Jesuits, but maintained his religion of Islam because in letters they refer to him as a Moorish infidel. And in the service of the Jesuits in India, he traveled with as a bodyguard for a Jesuit missionary named Valangano. So Valangano was on his way to Japan and to check on the missionary efforts of the Portuguese in Japan. In doing so, he needed to get permission from Nobungana, get permission from him in order to travel. This was a common way without passports that people traveled prior to the advent of passports. Well, in doing so, when he met Nobunga, there was also a conflict that occurred. This was during a time frame where they were trying to unify the Japanese island, the island of Japan, under one warlord, as they called him. And in doing so, when he came to Nobunga, he wanted to see him because people had broken down the Jesuits' doors, and some people had died because everybody was caught up in the idea of seeing this black man. Now, although Japanese history demonstrates that there were other Africans on the island of Japan during this time frame, it was still not something that you saw every day, and so people had their curiosities. I experienced a similar curiosity when I was in Germany, and in the cities, not so much of a big deal, but when you go out into the rural areas, then people often stared at you and wanted to touch you and see if your skin color rubbed off. So this created a stir in Japan. So when he was brought to Nobunga stronghold, he wanted to see if the black paint would wash off because he thought he just had ink on. So he washed him and washed him. They had him wash, and the black ink didn't come out. But he was so impressed with his strength, and he was legendized in the 17th century to say that he had the strength of 10 men. So he was legendized to that point, and Nobunaga decided that he wanted him to be in his own personal service. So of course the Jesuit agreed to that, And when he agreed to that and gave him away as a slave, and although some writers try to say that he was not a slave at this time frame, that he had earned his freedom in India, the fact that he was just arbitrarily given away to be the service of Nobaganga indicates that he was still most likely a slave. And in that service, he grew to become his sword bearer, and then he fought alongside him in some of his final battles in 1582. Now, there are many of the racists will scoff at the idea that he fought in a battle, but it was recorded that he fought in the final battle with him, with Nobaganga, and then at the end of the battle, then when Nobaganga lost by being betrayed by his own generals, that first Nobuganga's servant helped Nobaganga to perform the ritual sacrifice and then chop off his head, and then the servant asked for Yakusa to chop off his head. Now, in chopping off his head, he escaped with the head of the warlord Nobaganga, and that prevented the betraying general from being able to post his head as a sign of power and return the head to Nobuganga's son. Some historians say that he was then captured by the enemy, and the enemy was saying that because although a samurai, because he wasn't Japanese, he did not have to kill himself. He did not have to commit the ritual suicide. And so then he was returned to the Jesuit missionaries. There are letters from those missionaries that say that he was brought back and that he was then cared for and healed. And upon being healed, he was shipped back to India to live out the rest of his life. But the information on the rest of his life is very sketchy, and there's very little information. There's actually very little information about his life in Japan. What we have is mostly written by the enemies of Nobunaga, as well as some historians roughly about 30 to 50 years later. But what we do know for a fact is that he was in the higher ranking support cast of Nobunaga. He was awarded a stipend, he was awarded wives, he was given a private residence. Nobunaga's son gave him 10,000 pieces of monetary coin. So those things we are assured of, and we are assured that he participated in the ritual sacrifice of Nobunaga at the end of being betrayed by his generals. Now, according to some of the literature about him fighting and not fighting, it depends on whose side of the argument you want to accept. If you want to accept the Jesuit aspects of it, then he didn't fight in any wars. If you want to accept what the people in Japan wrote, then he fought alongside Nobunaga. So you can do with it what you will, but it is interesting that every Japanese creator that I've seen speaking on this subject matter are in full support of the idea that there was a black samurai. You can find other paintings and description of black sumo wrestlers, other black samurais in Japan that were circa 16th century. And so the Japanese culture fully embraces the idea that there was this black samurai, whereas it's interesting how Caucasian Americans, white Americans, have an issue with there being a black samurai. Is it not enough that you try to write black people out of your own history, that now you have to try to write black people out of someone else's history? You're giving colonizer vibes when you speak on this. If the Japanese people aren't speaking on it negatively, why do you feel like you have to speak on it negatively? Are you mad because a Canadian company, Ubisoft, is making him one of the primary characters of Assassin's Creed Shadows? What's your problem? You just letting the racism flow. But for those of us who did not know about this gentleman, it is just another part of the history of what was happening to black people throughout the centuries. But what do you guys think? Comment, share, and always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.